Are you a beginner photographer and still shooting in auto mode? If that sounds like you, this photography tutorial is for you. In this photography lesson, I'm going to show you a few key camera settings. Start using them and your photos will instantly look much better. Hey, my name is Alexander Ippolitov. I'm a member of the European Association of Professional Photographers, and my photos and articles have been published by National Geographic and Discovery. Alright, no long intros, let's get straight to it. First, let's do a basic setup of your camera. It doesn't matter what brand you're using, Canon, Nikon, Sony, or anything else. These settings will work for about 95% of modern cameras. Not absolutely all of them, but most. Now, I'm not going to explain how a camera technically creates an image. That's something I cover in detail in my photography course. What you do need to understand is this. Your camera can give you either a ready-to-use JPEG file or a RAW file, what many people call a digital negative. And yes, the RAW format can only be called a digital negative conditionally, but the idea is similar. A JPEG image is already processed by your camera. The camera decides contrast, sharpness, colors, everything based on picture styles you select in the menu. But if you want to take photography seriously, that's a problem. Because you should decide how your final image looks, not the camera. That's why I strongly recommend shooting in RAW. When you shoot RAW, you get an unprocessed file with all the data from the sensor. You can then develop that image in Lightroom or any other photo editor exactly the way you want. Here's a JPEG straight out of the camera. And here's the same image, developed from RAW. The difference is obvious, so I think the question, what format should I shoot in, answers itself. Now let's talk about picture styles. I get asked about this all the time. Here's the short and clear answer. Picture styles only work when you shoot JPEG. When you shoot RAW, picture styles do absolutely nothing. They cannot be applied to a digital negative. So don't worry about them if you're shooting RAW. Another common question is metering mode. I won't overload you here. At this stage, in about 95% of situations, center-weighted metering will work just fine. Set it and forget it. If you want to understand metering deeply, along with everything else that helps you take great photos, you're welcome to join my course I Am a Photographer. The link is in the description. Next important setting, color space. Set it to sRGB. Your menu might look different, but the option will be there. If you're shooting landscapes or static portraits, I also recommend setting your autofocus mode to single AF. That means when you press the shutter halfway, the camera focuses, and then locks focus. After that, you can slightly recompose your frame without losing focus. This is extremely useful. Alright, now we're getting to the good part, shooting modes. In auto mode, the camera controls everything, aperture, shutter speed, ISO. And yes, sometimes it works fine, but very often the camera makes mistakes. And even more often, it simply doesn't understand your creative idea. It might open the aperture when you want it closed, or close it when you want it open. I'm assuming you already understand aperture, shutter speed, and ISO. If not, go back to my very first lessons on this channel or check out my course. Now, back to shooting modes. Scene modes like portrait, landscape, sports are basically you telling the camera, hey, I'm shooting a portrait, do your thing. Will it do something? Yes. Will it do the right thing? Nobody knows. I don't trust automation. It has failed me many times. Some people say modern cameras have amazing auto modes. I disagree. In difficult lighting or complex scenes, automation fails, sometimes badly. So if you want to shoot more professionally, forget about auto and scene modes. So, should you jump straight into full manual mode? No, not yet. You'll know when you're ready. For now, there are two modes you'll use most of the time: aperture priority and shutter priority. About 80% of the time, aperture priority. About 20% of the time, shutter priority. Aperture priority is labeled AV on Canon cameras and A on most others. In this mode, you choose the aperture and the ISO. The camera chooses the shutter speed automatically. This is your main working mode. Shutter priority is labeled TV or S depending on the brand. Here, you choose the shutter speed and ISO, and the camera selects the aperture. So when do we use which? Portraits, aperture priority. Landscapes, aperture priority. Macro, aperture priority. So when do we use shutter priority? When motion matters. Sports photography, shutter priority. Freezing water splashes, shutter priority. Showing motion blur, also shutter priority. But let's go step by step. The goal in landscape photography is simple. Get as much of the scene sharp as possible. That means maximum depth of field, and that means a narrow aperture. Maximum sharpness usually starts around f7.1 and smaller. If you're using a full-frame camera, up to f16. If you're using a crop sensor, around f13. If you close the aperture even more, sharpness will start to drop because of diffraction. Don't overthink it. Just remember the numbers, stick to them, and only close the aperture further if you really need to. In portrait photography, we often want to separate the subject from the background. This is achieved using a shallow depth of field. Depth of field depends on several factors, but the main one is aperture. If you want a shallower depth of field, open the aperture wider. However, budget lenses can't open the aperture as wide as fast professional lenses. So what do you do in that case? If you want to achieve the shallowest depth of field your camera and lens are capable of, zoom in as much as possible and open the aperture to its maximum. In this case, the maximum aperture is f4. At this setting, you'll get the minimum depth of field. In other words, the maximum background blur your gear can produce. Another important factor is the distance to your subject. The closer the subject is to you, the shallower the depth of field will be. Use this to your advantage. Now let's talk about shutter priority in practice. You use it when shooting movement, either to freeze it or to show it. I'll demonstrate this mode using a small waterfall as an example. You might have noticed, I haven't talked about ISO yet. I saved it for last. Lower ISO is always better. Less noise, cleaner image. But you can't always use low ISO, especially in low light or with a narrow aperture. So your goal is simple. Use the lowest ISO possible. What does lowest possible mean? The lowest possible ISO is the ISO at which, when shooting handheld at your chosen focal length, you won't get motion blur caused by camera shake due to a slow shutter speed. Didn't understand? Let me explain it differently. When shooting in aperture priority mode, you choose the aperture and the camera chooses the shutter speed. At low ISO and insufficient light, the camera may select a shutter speed that's too slow for handheld shooting, resulting in blur. We need to make sure the shutter speed stays within safe limits. These limits depend on focal length. At wide angles, you can shoot handheld at slower shutter speeds. With longer focal lengths, you need much faster shutter speeds. How do you calculate a safe shutter speed? Simply divide 1 by double your focal length. For example, at a focal length of 50 mm, the safe shutter speed is 1/102nd. That's the threshold. Anything slower increases the risk of blur when shooting handheld. If your camera or lens has optical image stabilization, you can use slightly slower shutter speeds. But for now, let's assume there's no stabilization. So, choose your ISO in a way that prevents the camera from selecting a shutter speed slower than 1 divided by twice your focal length. And ideally, make the shutter speed even faster. This rule applies primarily to aperture priority mode. In shutter priority mode, ISO is selected based on the task at hand. And by the way, you can completely ignore this rule if you're shooting on a tripod.